Day. Thank you all for joining us for today's session of the Arab-Israeli conflict course. Today's session will focus in on Israel and Palestine, 1987 to 2021. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, my name is Ellen Resnick, and I'm the Educational Programs and Outreach Manager at Classrooms Without Borders. Thank you for being part of our community of learners. It is because of all of you and your commitment to supporting our mission and vision that we were able to design programs such as Avi's Arab-Israeli conflict course. We thank you for all your support and invite you to champion our outreach and partner with us. Please send any questions you may have directly to Avi via the chat feature. He will do his best to answer them all after his presentation. And before we turn the program over to Avi, our Executive Director, Dr. Sephora Gur, Sippy, would like to say a few words of welcome. Sippy, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm very excited to see all of you here today. I'm here this afternoon just to take a moment and thank Ellen Resnick, our Educational Program and Outreach Manager, Melissa Chaviv, the Assistant Director, and Avi Ben-Hur, our CWB Scholar, for an informative and stimulating course. Special thanks goes to our board members, and especially to one, my friend Bob, who helped underwrite this course. And to all of you all over the world, your desire to study, being engaged in this course, this is what Classroom Without Borders is all about. I want you to know that next month will be the last session. We are resuming our study seminars to Poland, Italy, and Germany this summer. Next year, you might want to join us with Avi that is leading. And we are traveling in June and July. So we are taking a short break from our virtual offerings. I want to promise you that we have a very interesting, stimulating fall semester coming your way. Stay healthy. Thank you for joining. And Avi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tippy. Good afternoon, everybody. Speaking to you from Jerusalem here, it's after 9 o'clock at night. So I believe that it's about time. We're coming down towards the end of our course, and it's about time for us to talk about the Israelis and Palestinians. And I think I'm going to start from the first Intifada. Before we start that, and that starting point is December 1987, we're going to take one step back. In the mid to late 1980s, Israel had a national unity government. What that meant was we had a rotation between Yitzhak Shamir and Shimon Peres, and each one got 2 years in the prime minister's seat, in the prime minister's office. And it's during those years that we came very, very close to coming up with some kind of confederation between Jordan and the Palestinians as part of a comprehensive peace agreement between Israel, Palestinians, and Jordanians, or maybe not. Let's go take a look.
We discussed the impasse. The problem was how to get the Palestinians to the negotiating table against Israeli opposition, against American opposition.
Hussein said, if you were clever, you would recognize the PLO. That would show everyone the truth. The PLO is just unwilling to negotiate.
Israel was willing to negotiate only with those Palestinians recognizing the right of Israel to exist.
Peace talks with Palestinians who accepted Israel's right to exist would exclude the PLO.
I had a little bit of time to think about it, and at the same time to see if I had any last thoughts before such a monumental decision was taken. And then I decided, all right, fine, we'll go.
The idea they came up with was a peace conference that excluded the PLO. Back in Israel, Shimon Peres faced a difficult meeting with his prime minister, Yitzhak Shamir. Peres's moderate Labor Party was part of a coalition that straddled the divide of Israeli politics. Shamir, a hardliner, opposed the conference. He wanted to negotiate separately with each Arab country and didn't want to deal with the Palestinians at all.
He said he'd agreed with King Hussein to hold an international conference. An international conference? For me, that would be as bad as a pig in the temple.
Shamir mistrusted Peres. He feared Israel would be outnumbered by the Arab states at the conference. Peres assured him the conference would quickly adjourn into individual talks with each Arab state, and the PLO would not be invited.
I said, leave the text. I'll read it later.
I said, no, I can't leave the agreement. Your staff might leak it and spoil my plan. It has to look like it comes from the Americans.
Peres and King Hussein agreed that only America had the clout to get everyone to attend. So Peres then contacted the American Secretary of State.
What he proposed now was that I take this on board as my proposal and then present it to the Israeli government.
I saw danger, even in a visit from Schultz. I decided to send an envoy to America. I sent our former ambassador.
And I told Schultz very plainly that the subject of the international conference was a subject of divided opinion in Israel, mainly between the Likud and the Labour Party, and that if he were to come to Israel to provide his support for the agreement that Peres had arrived at, he would be entering Israeli domestic politics. And he said, I'm not going to make the trip.
Trying to keep the process going, Peres persuaded Shamir to meet with Jordan's King Hussein. The king invited Shamir to his house in London. Hussein explained that he could represent the Palestinians.
The king was very critical of the Americans. He said, they made promises they didn't honor. They promised Jordan would get back the land Israel had occupied. But this hasn't happened. I thought to myself, I'm responsible for that.
He was very blunt. There was not very much room for putting any of the ideas or hopes or aspirations that I had in mind.
I refused point blank to discuss an international conference.
So there wasn't much that we could really speak about or agree about.
The next morning, I flew back to Jerusalem. None of my colleagues knew where I'd been or who I'd been meeting.
We got a report from that meeting from Shamir, who was very happy about it. The king was so courteous. He served a kosher meal. He was listened to me, and he was warm, and so on. We got a report from King Hussein, who said, well, we had the meeting, and it was terribly discouraging because it's obvious to me that the Prime Minister is not willing to give any ground at all.
Shamir rejected Hussein as a representative of the Palestinians.
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, what you just witnessed, what you just saw, was something that was put together by Shimon Peres and King Hussein of Jordan. And the basic ideas behind this was to create some kind of confederation where Jordan would basically be the midwife, not of a Palestinian state, but Jordan would be more or less in charge and kind of a semi-partnership with the Palestinians with Israel's acquiescence. And Yitzhak Shamir was not having anything to do with that. And it's important because what you saw totally collapsed by 1988. This is important because evidently word leaked out to the Palestinians this was happening. And the Palestinians perceived this as something that was taking place at their expense. They didn't see King Hussein of Jordan as their leader or Jordan as a Palestinian state. And this is important because it also explains to a certain extent, just to a certain extent, the outbreak of the First Intifada, which outbreak in December of 1987. This is taking place while these talks are kind of not going anywhere, not coming to fruition, but the Palestinians already know about it. This is not to say that the First Intifada is because of the failure of these talks or because the talks are taking place, but I'm saying that this is yet another element to take into consideration. We're trying to understand how and why the Palestinians broke out into an uprising in December of 1987. Let's see some more.
Meanwhile, the Palestinians, squeezed into the Gaza Strip for the last 20 years under Israeli rule, grew increasingly frustrated. On December 8, 1987, an Israeli truck accidentally hit a car carrying 4 Palestinian laborers.
All the people in the car were killed. We thought this was no accident. It was done on purpose by the Israelis.
Angry crowds soon gathered. An 18-year-old Palestinian threw a stone at some Israeli soldiers. When they fired back, the boy was killed. The Israeli security forces then stepped up their presence in the occupied territories. A group of young activists seized the opportunity to prepare a leaflet calling for an uprising.
Early in the morning, our leaflet was ready. We had cars standing by. We asked children and pregnant women to help. They could slip past the Israelis at the checkpoint.
Palestinian workers were urged to go on strike. Shopkeepers were told to shut their businesses. The Intifada had begun.
So, ladies and gentlemen, if you understood correctly, we're talking about something spontaneous. This was not planned. The so-called First Palestinian Intifada, First Palestinian Uprising. It was spontaneous combustion. By the way, what the gentleman failed to say when he was interviewed, the Palestinian activist, was the 4 people who were killed in that car accident, that took place several days after a settler was murdered by Palestinians. In other words, Palestinians read into this accident as an Israeli revenge action, the fact that a settler had been murdered, which is not in fact the case. It actually was a car accident, but that's the way it was perceived. I think it's very important to understand that there was no guiding hand in terms of Palestinians, not on an international level, because you have to keep in mind that Arafat had been kicked out of Lebanon. We told that story in 1982 and forced to move to Tunis. So the PLO was actually not present. The leadership of the PLO was not present. And the local Palestinian leadership also was not a guiding hand. They tried to take control over this, as did the folks in Tunis. But the reality was this was spontaneous, and it took some time for any kind of leadership to emerge on the scene. So a lot of these scenes you've seen before. Israelis were not prepared for this. Israeli troops were not trained to deal with the civil disobedience, civil uprising. With full disclosure, I finished my obligatory service, my compulsory service, in the summer of '87, some 6 months before this broke out. And I found myself throughout my first degree in university, in Hebrew University of Jerusalem, in reserve duty, spending between 30 and 40 days each year dealing with exactly with this. And we really were not trained for this. We were also getting all kinds of police dispersal weapons that we didn't know how to use or had to be trained on. We were not policemen. We were not trained for that. And of course, combat soldiers are trained to use lethal force, not to use police force.
I told him the Intifada must not change tactics. Don't use weapons or guns. Don't give the Israelis an excuse to use their technology. We want to tie down as many soldiers as we can.
So the gentleman you just saw now, Faisal Husseini, was the son of Abed Kadr Husseini, who was the top Palestinian commander who was killed quite early on in our war for independence on the night between the 7th and 8th of April, 1948. That was his father. He was a baby at the time, the gentleman you saw now, and he emerged as one of the leaders of this first Intifada. And actually, he also emerged as one of the very moderate Palestinian leaders during the Oslo process, but he also died of a heart attack at a relatively young age during those years. So this, I think, is a very poignant photograph, because certainly in 1982, when Israel invaded Lebanon, Israel lost its allure as a country that was, let's say, kind of a David, or a country that was fighting wars, existential wars. 1982 was definitely not an existential war. Nobody perceived it as such in Israel. But the first Intifada actually put Israel out in the international arena as a lethal force that was fighting against civilians. So long story short, David versus Goliath, where Israel was the Goliath and the Palestinians became David. And actually that narrative hasn't changed since.
When the Israeli cabinet met, members of the coalition argued about how best to end the Intifada.
Ariel Sharon spoke up. In essence, he said, "Mr. Prime Minister, we must order the army to suppress the Intifada. The army will find a way."
Some of the ministers made horrifying suggestions. They suggested, send in the tanks, kill 1,000 and it will collapse. Order will be restored to Israel. We knew if we killed 1,000, it would get worse, and we would be branded war criminals.
The cabinet rejected all of this, but told the defense minister, Yitzhak Rabin, to find a way to end the Intifada.
Rabin stood in front of the soldiers and said, "Gentlemen, don't just stand there. Use your hands, use your clubs, beat the demonstrators, restore order."
Yes, and actually that was translated into newsfeed as Rabin saying, break their hands, break their knees. Now this is, you have to keep in mind, this is Yitzhak Rabin in 1988, 89. And 3 years later, or 4 years later, he's going to be embarking on the Oslo process. So that's, we talk about a transition, and look at Yitzhak Rabin as somebody who led the IDF in its greatest victory in 1967, the 6 Days War. And here he is, just a few, 3-4 years before he begins the Oslo process. He's shaking Arafat's hand on the White House lawn, and we're going to be seeing those images. Look at the gap, and look how fast that gap was closed in a very short amount of time. We need to talk about that as well. So here we go. This is the command, and these are, of course, the images that you're seeing. You're seeing an Israeli soldier with a club, and you're seeing a child in his hands.
In London in December 1992.
Okay, sorry for a second. I'm going to stop that for a moment. What's interesting is the First Intifada kind of peters out around the time of the first Gulf War. I'm saying that because, on the one hand, the Palestinians really didn't get anywhere with it. It wasn't really making any change for them. On the other hand, Israel was learning better how to deal with the civil disobedience, how to use less lethal force. It was a slow process. It wasn't a fast learning curve. It was a slow learning curve, but it was happening. And you already had Palestinian leadership that began to be in control of the First Intifada, which means they could direct it more effectively. But because there were no tangible results, it began to peter out almost on its own. And then came the first Gulf War. The first Gulf War, on the one hand, Palestinians, made a kind of cardinal error, both vis-a-vis Israel and also vis-a-vis the eyes of the world, where they were, handing out candies and jumping for joy every time a Scud missile was shot by Saddam Hussein on Israel. On the other hand, President George Bush Sr. Was able to leverage the fact the United States put together a fairly effective coalition to take care of Saddam Hussein and push him out of Kuwait, to leverage a first peace conference ever of almost all the players in the Middle East that were relevant to the Arab-Israeli conflict. And one of the big questions at the peace conference, with the reforming this was, Israel refused to have any Palestinians represented there, a representation of Palestinians. At this point, it has to be understood that Israel did not recognize officially Palestinians as a people that could demand or deserve self-determination, did not recognize the PLO. It was illegal for Israeli officials to speak with the PLO. And essentially, it was very interesting. There were Palestinian representatives that participated in the Jordanian delegation. And it was clear that they were members of the PLO, but they were actually participating within the Jordanian delegation. Of course, we all know that the Madrid conference went absolutely nowhere. This is 1991. It went absolutely nowhere. But we're going to see that rather quickly, soon afterwards, things are actually going to start to move. That's where we are right now.
In London in December 1992, a PLO representative from Tunis was on assignment.
I had never met an Israeli before, not one. All the way to the meeting, I was looking left and right, and behind me, I was afraid of being seen.
The Israeli who initiated the meeting was waiting for him. He was an academic with unofficial connections to Israel's new labor government.
It was a moment of truth. Meeting a PLO man was against the law.
The Israelis' cover for meeting a member of the PLO was provided by a fellow social scientist from Oslo.
I simply suggested that Hirschfeld and myself had breakfast, and then that when Abu Allah arrived in the lobby, I should simply discreetly slip away from the table and Abu Allah should take my place.
We spoke about the conflict, which had no end in sight. It had been raging for the whole century. So how could we end it?
PLO headquarters in Tunis awaited his report.
Abu Allah told us what had happened. I said, if they ask you to go again, go. He asked, what's the point of talking to these people? I said, well, there must be something behind it.
We were nearly arrested when we landed. We didn't have visas. Nobody met us. Instead of being treated as VIPs, we were grilled for 2 hours by the Norwegians.
We had to be so careful that we did not even inform the Norwegian secret police about their arrival.
Abu Allah, with 2 fellow Palestinians, was driven through the snow to a country mansion near Oslo. Here, he and the Israeli professor got down to business. I said to Abu Allah, we must focus on topics where agreement is possible. We must put to one side subjects we know we can't resolve. In dispute were the Palestinian territories ruled by Israel, Gaza and the West Bank, and most disputed of all, Jerusalem. I said, we won't agree about Jerusalem. He talked about Palestinian control of the entire West Bank. I said, listen, we won't agree to that. Let's focus on Gaza first.
Every Palestinian was suspicious about Gaza first. The Israelis wanted to get rid of Gaza. For them, Gaza was just a factory of problems and the Intifada.
Back in Tunis, after the first Oslo meeting, Abu Allah voiced his concern about the idea of Gaza first.
Abu Mazen said, if any Palestinian land is offered, we should take it. Why reject Gaza?
Then Arafat said, I want Jericho as well. I asked him, why Jericho? He said, to get a foothold in the West Bank.
The foreign ministry decided it was time to tell Rabin about the secret back channel. Though skeptical, Rabin thought it could be useful. Soon afterwards, Israel's Oslo team brought home a draft which the 2 sides called a Declaration of Principles.
They came back very excited and said, we have a draft. It was obviously still rough, but they said, look, the PLO are willing to play ball.
At the beginning, the drafts were very, very bad to Israel.
He was suspicious that the PLO was using the Oslo track in order to somehow trick Israel into concessions and then using what was said in Oslo against Israel in Washington.
I said, Yitzhak, forget Washington.
Maybe the PLO was trying to tell us that they were prepared to be more flexible than the official positions expressed in Washington.
I had my doubts, but I said, go ahead, try.
Well, you know what's going to happen next.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Arafat, Chairman of the Executive Council of the Palestine Liberation Organization, His Excellency Yitzhak Rabin, Prime Minister of Israel, the President of the United States.
The moment I saw Arafat walking out from the White House with Rabin next to him and Clinton and so on, imagine this White House that said bye-bye to the PLO, that branded Arafat as a terrorist, Rabin, the chief of staff who occupied the West Bank and Jerusalem, and it was electrifying.
Rabin didn't want to look at Arafat. It was terrible. The whole world is watching his body language, and he keeps moving his head not to look at Arafat.
And I did not think that they will shake hands.
He hesitated a little bit, but I insisted and I continued stretching my hand to him.
And then the way President Clinton pulled it, it was evident that wasn't planned.
Yeah. Rabin didn't live long enough to see whether or not he would regret shaking the hand of Arafat. But in any event, what you can see in front of you is what was birthed in the Oslo process, not what's signed in 1993, which is basically the PLO and Israel mutually recognizing each other, but what's known as Oslo II, which was really the main redeployment of Israeli forces outside the centers of the Palestinian populations. And if you take a look at the map in front of you, I know it's in Hebrew, but make it very simple for you. The darker color there on the map in the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria, essentially is called Area A. And those are the large concentration of the Palestinian populations in the Palestinian cities. And those were turned over to the Palestinian Authority, full administrative and political and security control over those areas. And that constitutes something to the tune of, 14% overall of the West Bank. Area B, which is that mustard, like the light yellow color that you can see, much of which is adjacent to the areas A, the darker color. It's another 12, it's another almost 16%, and those are under complete administrative and political control of the Palestinian Authority, but theoretically joint security control, really Israeli security control. And Area C, which is that light green color, which constitutes 60% of Judea and Samaria or the West Bank, is under 100% Israeli control. So this is the Oslo II, which is going to play out actually in terms of on the ground, starting from 1995, and the complete redeployment will take place in 1998. Those years are very, very important because the beginning of the implementation of this redeployment is in September of 1995, and Yitzhak Rabin is going to be murdered in beginning of November of 95, and by December, most of the redeployment has taken place, has been completed. The one area where it did not take place is where you can see I'm pointing out over here, okay, which is the area of Hebron, and essentially that's going to take place when Benjamin Netanyahu is already prime minister, because he begins in 1996, and that's probably that's something that is going to take place as a result of negotiations between Netanyahu and the Palestinian Authority. In any event, as you know,
but the agreement
Oslo doesn't
did
go
not
smoothly.
bring peace. In the occupied territories, a large number of Palestinians vowed to continue the fight. In Israel, too, the opposition was fierce.
We think that this endangers Israel, and what I would do as prime minister is to do anything responsible within the rule of law to stop and nullify the dangers that emanate from this agreement with the PLO to Israel's security.
Yep, we have to keep in mind that when we take a look at the public opinion polls that were taken during the Oslo years, which means between 1993 and 2000 to all intents and purposes, there was a majority of Israelis that were for the Oslo Accords. But when you removed the Arab citizens of Israel from those public opinion polls, and you just looked at the Jewish citizens of Israel, which is not a democratic way of doing it. I'm just saying if one did that, you would find that it was very, very close to 50-50. There was a slight majority of Jews, 50 point something percent, that was for and slightly less than 50% that was against. So it was very, very a divisive issue among Israeli Jews. But hey, democracy is taking the pulse of the entire country, and virtually all Israeli Arab citizens, who at that time constituted something to the tune of 19 to 20% of the population, they were all for it. So when you look at through that prism, it had a majority, but there was a lot of opposition in Israeli Jewish society, obviously from the national religious, obviously from the right wing, obviously from people who, beyond the fact that they perceived Judea and Samaria as the patrimony of the Jewish people that was given Jewish people by God, and so on and so forth. You also had people on the political right who thought that this was a strategic mistake. The Palestinians could not be trusted, that we're giving up the topographical high ground to terrorists, and so on and so forth. So it's not just the image you see in front of you is a little bit misleading. It's not just, let's say, modern Orthodox national religious, but there were plenty of right-wing people who were not religious at all, and we're not looking into the prism of theology or religious prism, or even an historic one, but rather a strategic one, and saw it as a big mistake. What's going to start taking place is incitement against Yitzhak Rabin as prime minister. One has to say with transparency as well that Yitzhak Rabin did not intelligently attempt to embrace or speak to the political opposition on the Israeli Jewish right. In fact, he disparaged them, and that was a mistake. When you take into consideration what's going to happen in 2005, and we're going to talk about this our next meeting, when Ariel Sharon is prime minister, and he's one of the architects of the settlement movement, and he's going to uproot all of the Israeli Jewish settlements from the Gaza Strip. He does it while embracing the settlers there and and feels their pain and express it that way, and so on and so forth. And that's not the way Rabin went. And so this is not in any way, shape, or form to say that incitement against the prime minister was justified. I'm just trying to understand or explain, I should say, what the feeling was among the political right. They felt they're being disparaged, and they took up the call to arms against the prime minister. And here we have, of course, you're not seeing it very well here, but the truth is that one of the most powerful and problematic, actually you can see it, let me see. No, you cannot see it. One of the most powerful of the posters you had on anti-government demonstrations from the political right in 1995 was Rabin portrayed in an SS uniform. A Jew calling a Jew a Nazi is much worse than cursing his mother. And I think enough said.
Makers held a rally in Tel Aviv.
We sang, the three of us, the singer Miri Aloni, Yitzhak, and myself. Yitzhak and I are not such great singers. He had the words of the peace song on a sheet of paper. After we sang, out of tune, Yitzhak folded it and put it in the pocket of his jacket.
On the way to his car, he was shot dead by an Israeli extremist.
3 bullets went through his heart and through the song.
The government of Israel, with shock and sorrow, announces the death of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who was murdered by an assassin tonight in Tel Aviv.
Why? Why have they done this?
So, folks, what you see in front of you are the bloodstained words on the song that Rabin was told. This is what Rabin had folded in his pocket, and it's his own blood that stained it. Rabin was assassinated by an Israeli Jew, Orthodox, law student at Bar-Ilan University. In his interrogation, he clarified that He thought that the Oslo process was a disaster for the Jewish people and Jewish history, and he aimed to derail it, which to a certain extent he succeeded in doing. I'm sure you're all aware of the fact that Shimon Peres, who was deputy prime minister, becomes a prime minister, but he's going to lose the elections the following year, 1996, to Benjamin Netanyahu, who, despite all of his fine words of opposing Oslo, couldn't tear down the agreement that the previous government had made, and in fact will make some more concessions to Arafat. Netanyahu is going to last for 3 years, and in 1999, he is going to find himself losing the election to Ehud Barak. Ehud Barak had previously been the chief of staff of the IDF. He was the head of the Labour Party, and he was determined to continue in Rabin's footsteps to a certain extent. Just something in brackets. The Oslo process was a staged process where the slogan was confidence building measures. Those confidence building measures actually didn't mutual confidence building measures actually didn't really take place. I'll give you some examples of what I'm talking about. So on the Palestinian side, the Palestinians considered anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, and anti-Semitic rhetoric and incitement on their radio programs, on their TV programs, in their educational system. And although it wasn't spurred by the PA necessarily, terror did take place, especially on Hamas, and not just Hamas, against Israeli targets during the 1990s, while this process was taking place. On the Israeli side, in 1992, on the eve of the Oslo process, there were some 100,000 Israeli Jewish settlers living over the Green Line in the West Bank of Judea and Samaria. And by 2000, there were about 192,000. It means the number had almost doubled. And the Palestinian read on that is, wait a second, if you're saying you're making peace with us, and although the words Palestinian state were not used in the documentation, it was clear to everybody involved in negotiations that was the end game at some point. And Palestinians saying, wait a second, how could it be that you're talking about statehood and you doubled the number of settlers that are living in land that's supposed to be part of our Palestinian state? So that was one issue. Another issue, of course, was that the Palestinians didn't really get to reap the fruit of their labor. Meaning, and here it kind of came from two different directions. On the one hand, the Palestinian leadership was pocketing the billions and billions of dollars, US and euros, that were coming in international aid, and Arafat and his cronies pocketed that money instead of building clinics and schools and roads and houses for refugees and so on and so forth. It did not go to the Palestinian people or for the good of the Palestinian people. That's the first thing. But at the same time, every time there was a terror attack emanating from the Gaza Strip, both in the West Bank, didn't matter if it was Hamas, Israel put a closure on the territories and prevent, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from coming to work in Israel because you didn't know who you can trust. And Israel really desperately needed the labor. I'll remind you that the 1990s was a huge surge of emigration from the former Soviet Union. We had in one decade, a little over 1 million former Soviets emigrate to Israel. 1 million people joined 5 million people. And you had to put a lot of housing. And the builders were the Palestinians. They were the ones who were doing all the building. And every time Israel make a closure, because in the wake of a terror attack, all the construction was grinding to a halt. So what Israel did in the 1990s was they replaced the Palestinians with Romanian workers and Thai workers, and ultimately Turkish workers, and ultimately Chinese workers. And at the end of the day, Palestinians also did not, their economy was also going down. So, they felt that they weren't really reaping the fruits of their labors. In any event, we get to the year 2000, President Clinton, who was basically in the twilight of his presidency, is going to invite Prime Minister Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat to Camp David. This is June of 2000, and the idea is to try to hammer out a final status accord. Barak wants to go all the way, very analytical, and evidently makes what from an Israeli perspective, and I'm emphasizing this, Israeli perspective, was the most generous offer ever made to Palestinians, which meant a state with something like 90% of their territorial demands. Barak was evidently willing to divide Jerusalem. He was willing to go very, very far, but there were several issues on which the agreement or the potential agreement foundered or collapsed. There were three big ones. First one was over Jerusalem. And regarding Jerusalem, Arafat was not willing to make any kind of concessions, particularly regarding the holy sites, specifically the Temple Mount. He wouldn't recognize any Jewish history or right to any kind of sovereignty on the Temple Mount. This is one problem. Number two, the Palestinians dragged in the refugee issue as demanding a right of return for refugees. And the third thing was, Ehud Barak said, look, these negotiations succeed, no more demands, that's it. These are concessions and this is it. In other words, once this deal is made, it's over. That's it, conflict over. No more negotiations, no more concessions. And again, from the Israeli perspective, Arafat was the reason for the collapse of these talks. Palestinians point blame at the Israelis. Clinton pointed a bigger finger at the Palestinians, but either way, things fall apart. And during these negotiations, the most important issues on the table were, first of all, how do you create security for both sides? What would the borders look like to these two states? And who would control the borders? For example, who would control the border between the Palestinians and Jordan? Question of what do you do with the settlers and the settlements in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip? Do we divide Jerusalem? Do we not divide Jerusalem? It's a shared city, it's a divided city. What about the holy sites there? What about water resources? What about refugees? These were and still are the main issues that would be in a potential negotiating process if there is one. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this thing collapsed in the summer of 2000. In September 27th, Ariel Sharon goes up to the Temple Mount, surrounded by about 1,000 policemen. He basically more or less just says, this is ours forever, and comes back down. And basically, he was out of political opposition. He wasn't talking to Palestinians. He was talking to the Israeli electorate, saying the other guy, the prime minister, is willing to give this to the Palestinians, which Barak wasn't willing to do, but just saying the other guy is willing to divide Jerusalem. If I'm elected prime minister, I will never divide Jerusalem. Okay, by the way, that was a winning combination. He won. He defeated Barak in election that took place about 6 months later. In any event, what's going to happen following Ariel Sharon's ascent to the Temple Mount, making those kind of statements, was the outbreak of the so-called Second Intifada, or the Second Palestinian Uprising. We have to keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, that this one evidently was not as spontaneous as the first one. Here there was leadership, a directed one, direct leadership, and this so-called uprising consisted of people strapping bombs on themselves and entering, for example, this was a Sbarro pizza place, one of the main intersections in the heart of West Jerusalem. Many people were killed, by the way, Arabs as well, because as you know, bombs don't discriminate. We had buses being blown up. We had cafes, my local neighborhood supermarket, and so on and so forth. And what's very interesting is that during the first 18 months of the so-called Palestinian uprising, or Intifada, we had a change of government. Barak lost the elections to Ariel Sharon. Both of them former generals. Both of them restrained the IDF from going back into the territories or back into Areas A that were under complete Palestinian Authority control. But what we have is in March of 2002, in 1 month, 140 Israelis are killed in acts of terror, and about 30 people are going to be murdered over their Passover dinner at a hotel in Netanya, just north of Tel Aviv. And the security cabinet is going to meet. And first decision that emerged in that meeting is to send the IDF back into the Palestinian territories to reestablish intelligence networks and to tamp down on terror. And an operation that theoretically took 4 months, but in reality is still going on to some extent till today, succeeded in breaking this thing. The second decision, which took several months later, was to build some kind of barrier in order to slow down the attackers. And what you're seeing here is a section or a cross-section of the barrier when it is a fence, which is about 90% of it is fence. And the other 10% is this 8 to 9 meter high wall. And this, of course, was deemed as fairly successful or effective. When you take a look at a graph of the attacks, you'll notice that this starts being constructed in 2002. Within about 3 or 4 years, the success of the suicide bombings goes down dramatically. One can make the argument that Arafat died, which is true, and that he was replaced by Abu Mazen, who's still in the driver's seat till today, who was opposed to the terror from the very beginning. But one also has to admit that this barrier also does work. The map you have in front of you, despite the fact that it is in Hebrew, is showing you the red line there, is showing you the route or the proposed route of this barrier or this obstacle. The green line is the green line. So for example, if you follow my cursor, you can see that the barrier actually cuts over the green line and grabs territory. And it's not just here, it's here, and it's here, and it's here. Okay, and you can see it in various places. This is important because it does grab some of the territory. Till today, about 65% has been constructed. I have to change this slide because it's not 13 billion shekels, it's 17 billion shekels. That's a stat that's relatively new from a few weeks ago. And of course, 17 billion shekels divided by 3.35 to get the dollar amount. That's quite a lot. In any event, this is the planned barrier you see here. The reality on the ground is only 65% has actually been constructed. Okay, and I think that I want to close this down and open up to questions. I'm sure there are a lot of questions. I just want to give a snapshot of where we are today. Okay, all these years later. So let's begin with the fact that we haven't had direct negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians since 2014. Most recent public opinion surveys that have taken place both in Israel and Palestinian territories have shown that the support for a two-state solution is ebbing. It's declining dramatically on both sides of this story. The 4 elections that took place between 2020 and 2021, the peace issue, negotiating with the Palestinians, was not on anybody's electoral platform. Okay, not a plank on anybody's platform, which is showing that Israelis are really not interested in this story. As we're going to talk about in our next meeting regarding the challenge we're facing in Gaza, starting from 2007, Hamas took over the Gaza Strip, which means the Palestinian Authority no longer is running the show there, which means that today you don't need a two-state solution, you need a three-state solution. As I mentioned previously, in 1992, I'm sorry, let's do it again. That's a mistaken stat. In 1992, you had 100,000 settlers living in the West Bank. In 2000, you had 100,000 in 1992. You had 192,000 in 2000, and this year you have already 450,000. So that's not a critical mass, but we're getting very close to a critical mass. And maybe most importantly, the world is basically disengaged from this process. There's no pressure, certainly on Israel or the Palestinians, to make any kind of concessions today. So we're basically in a situation of stasis. Although that does not mean that all is well here or there. So with your permission, folks, I am going to check out the questions that you've been beaming to me and attempt to answer some of them. So let's do that again. All right. I'm being asked a question: was there ever a chance for peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians? Very hard to answer that question. As everybody here knows, it takes 2 to tango. And the assumption of a chance for peace assumes that both sides are interested in making the commensurate concessions they would have to make. Let's be honest. It's the reality on the ground is that you need strong leadership, and you need to have people have the capacity, leaders have the capacity to make concessions. Because when you negotiate, if one side walks away from negotiation feeling great and the other one feels bad, that was a bad negotiation. If both sides walk away from negotiation thinking, okay, I didn't get everything I wanted, but I got enough, that's a good negotiation. And evidently that did not transpire. We're certainly in a situation today where there's a very, very weak leadership on both sides, both the Israeli and the Palestinian side. Look, the present Israeli Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, who's got 6 seats in the parliament, which is unprecedented, I think, in Israeli history. His is one of the smaller parties in the coalition, in the ruling coalition. It's teetering on the edge of maybe collapsing tomorrow morning. I mean that literally and figuratively. He has been opposed to a Palestinian state since 2013 till today. So I mean, yeah, one has to understand that. I think that we're not certainly not a place where one can imagine it right now. Could have been imagined in the past? Yeah, I think in the 1990s there were plenty of people on both sides who thought that we were actually heading for a peace agreement. But listen, we saw how things played out. Let's see what we have here. Any more questions? People asking me. No more questions. Here we go. Okay, the question I'm being asked here is who is the likely successor to Abu Mazen, who is the head of the Palestinian Authority, and does that person share the same views as Abu Mazen? So Abu Mazen is somebody who has opposed the use of violence, certainly for as long as he's been running the show. He's also a very weak leader. I think he's 86. There is no clear succession. We do not know who's going to succeed him. And there's a real concern, some might say fear, that at the end of the day, it's going to be a complete collapse into chaos in the West Bank and Judea and Samaria when he meets his maker. So I'm being asked the question, can I discuss the low popularity in Israel of President Barack Obama and its effect on the stalled peace process? So look, to be perfectly honest, when one very closely examines President Obama's policies, specifically towards Israel, during his 8 years as a president, you'll notice that Israel got more financial aid and more military aid than ever before. And those are numbers, those are objective numbers. But the perception was the exact opposite. And that perception was sold very, very well to the Israeli public by the prime minister, who was Benjamin Netanyahu. He succeeded in convincing Israelis that Obama was if not an anti-Semite, he was against Israel. And many Israelis bought into that narrative. Did that impact the peace process? Look, again, the peace process, you have to have two to tango. And I think that the United States was willing to press the sides together. President Obama pressured Israel into freezing settlements, okay? And Netanyahu went with that. And Abu Mazen didn't step up to the plate. There was no negotiations, so it was ridiculous. So you didn't really have movement, and this has to do with the fact that again, you have to have leaders on both sides that are willing and able to make commitments and the concessions. And Abu Mazen couldn't move things forward, or couldn't or wouldn't move things forward. Second, what else do we have? Is there any other way peace could possibly be achieved other than the establishment of a Palestinian state? Look, I'm not one of the people who subscribes to the idea of a one-state solution. I think that'll be disaster for both peoples. I think it's not workable, and it'll bring even more bloodshed. It's very difficult to imagine right now. I think maybe some kind of confederation might work, but again, this is something that has to be acceptable to all sides, to both sides, and one should not assume that people on both sides are willing to make the commensurate concessions, including on the Israeli side. Is Iran considered the biggest security problem in Israel than the Palestinians? Unequivocally, the answer is yes. Although I'm not sure if that's really true, meaning, yes, that's what is considered, but I'm not sure that that consideration is correct. Why aren't Palestinians allowed to travel to other countries? Palestinians are allowed to go to Jordan and from there to other countries. For Gazans, that's a different story. They can go to Egypt, but Egypt makes difficulties for them as well. The strong influence of the religious parties in Israel, its coalitions always make the peace chance almost nil. Look, the person who asked the question about religious parties in Israel, one has to distinguish between ultra-Orthodox parties, which have their very, very specific sectorial issues that interest them. For example, housing and education. Those are their biggest issues, not security of the Palestinians. That distinguish between them, the ultra-Orthodox, and the national religious, who have a political agenda and theological agenda that would oppose the establishment of a Palestinian state. The reality on the ground is that up until, I don't know, maybe 6-7 years ago, the national religious certainly did not have any kind of significant numerical standing that made it a kingmaker or king breaker. That was not the case. That is the case vis-a-vis the ultra-Orthodox. The ultra-Orthodox, though, didn't usually for a long time weigh in on these issues of the Palestinians. So no, I do not think that that it's because of the strong influence of the religious parties in Israel in the coalitions that always makes peace chance almost nil. I don't agree. They didn't have any place in the 1990s in the Oslo process, and still peace didn't happen, and they were not in power. Okay, let's see what else we have here. Okay, I've got a slew of questions here regarding the state of Israeli Arab citizens and of Palestinians. Look, let's make a distinction between Arab citizens of the State of Israel and Palestinians who are not citizens of the State of Israel, which are the Palestinians of the West Bank and the Palestinians of Gaza. Israel, within the State of Israel, there are slightly more than 2 million Arabs who are full citizens of the State of Israel, and they constitute today some 21% of the Israeli citizens. So they're in a very precarious and also interesting situation. On the one hand, for the first time, they actually have an Arab party in the ruling coalition that is actually making a lot of gains for that society, for Arab society, in terms of budgets, and they're really trying hard to solve some of the big. They're trying to move forward in terms of dealing with the huge gaps you have between Jewish and Arab society in Israel, in terms of education, infrastructure, jobs, and so on and so forth. And the real strides, even though it's 1 year, real strides are being made. So that's on the positive side of the ledger. On the other hand, the Israeli Jewish polity and electorate have become more right-wing. There's more racism in Israeli society towards Arabs, for sure. And there's more violence towards Arabs in Israeli society. And so it's it's kind of a two sides of the coin. You know, there are incredible strides being made by Israeli Arabs, and it gets even stranger because during COVID, you know, it was really highlighted this kind of shoulder to shoulder struggle against COVID. The Arabs in the medical field in Israel are way larger than the proportion in Israeli society. So something like some crazy number, like 40% of the pharmacists are Arab nationally, and some 30 some odd % of the doctors in Israel are Arabs nationally. And there's an even higher percentage of nurses, and they were in the front lines, you know, and everybody was working together to fight COVID, and that was a moment. That was a very powerful moment. But in the middle of all that, you also had things explode between Jews and Arabs in Israel last May, about a year ago May, and let's be honest, the Temple Mount is always a good place to start a fight, a good place to pour oil on a fire. And both sides are expert, extremists on both sides are expert at doing that. And one can make the argument that the Israeli government has not been motivated enough and or smart enough to nip some of that stuff in the bud. So we'll see what's going to happen. I'm going to do one last issue here. Will the Abraham Accords have an influence towards the acceptance of Israel as a country in the greater Arab society? The Abraham Accords are great, but the reality is religious conflict over the Temple Mount or the Haram al-Sharif, noble sanctuary, same place, can cause everything to tumble down. And we have to find some kind of modus vivendi to put that fire out, that constant fire out, because that really can set things on fire here in a big way. Okay, so ladies and gents, thank you for the great questions. Hope you enjoyed this session. We have one last session where I can tell you that we're laying out the main strategic and tactical, and to a certain extent existential challenges that are facing Israel today. I'll be looking at the northern front, meaning Hezbollah, the eastern front, which means Iran, and we'll be looking at the southern front. Let's call that Gaza and Hamas. So that's our next meeting. Stay tuned, stay healthy, and start coming to Israel again. Skies are open.
Fantastic. Thank you, Avi, and thank you everyone for joining us. As Avi mentioned, our last session is scheduled in June. That will be the 21st at 2 p.m. Avi told you the topic. It's going to focus in on Israel and Lebanon, 2006 to 2021, Israel and Syria, 2000 to 2021, and Israel and Iran, 2000 to 2021. Next week, we have 2 sessions. On Wednesday, we have our Confronting the Complexity of Holocaust Scholarship with Michael Berenbaum. And on Thursday, we have our documentary film discussion. Both of those are at 3 p.m. Avi will be back facilitating our documentary film discussion. Please sign up for these programs and more on our new website. And I'm going to drop this in the chat. The old website is still working, so you absolutely can still use the old website. But our new website is www.cwbpgh.org/events. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you all again soon. Bye, everyone.